Wana wanzeru kukajama maha amatengataje kusesa bakomo pamaimaje kukajama early morning amatengataje kusesa bakomo pamaimaje Magoro ali akujiri nero manyamene nawanze Magoro ali akujiri nero manyamene nawanze Nindeko uyuri nero manyamene nawanze Udina madimbo manamene nawanze akide gogo wana madimbo namuyanikira udina madimbo manamene nawanze simuku namago izina maoda bambo wahada nisina sandeka Karizina mboni maoda Bambo anga kamali natsandeka Gonda mama Gonda mama jama Tafera Gonda mama Gonda mama jama Tafera mwenda we Nagomba mbio Zogo Baba kumtima kwatira baba watwana oye Zina raje musoro Kunamba kwandani kutima kwatira Baba kumtima kwatira baba watwana oye Zina raje musoro Kunamba kwandani kutima kwatira Musoro mai Musoro mai Mana nene damai waje dikuna Niuke Mana nene damai waje dikuna Mapenzi wose akapunzire muyuke Mapenzi wose apunzire muyuke Namba kukamba kumatibego jemeri Chemberi, unari chemberi, unari chemberi, mama mwe, mwe, kare, unari chemberi, Chalamanda, 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 inakwana tabera nikono. Agidesi, 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 inakwana tabera nikono. Sinari tonto kare nkawia na polo, iwajabe. Napolo iwajabe, wajabe, wajabe. Wadinga ingalamu, ukataya kumkenga, ukimaka idugadola, obelado ninalira maiwe, wajabe, wajabe, wajabe. Send the buffalo soldier, buffalo Jamaica, buffalo soldier, buffalo Jamaica. And I was a young boy, I give you the America. And I was a young boy, I dream of you there in America. Oh, yo, 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 oh, yo, yo, oh, yo, yo, yo. As you get on so good, oh, yo, 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 oh, yo, yo, oh, yo, yo, yo. If I had imagined my day, I go to see.
What's up, family? It's 12:50 East African time on the 27th of July 2024. And this is the Black Hot Fire Network, the media of the 21st century. Today I started the show with some African jams, really amazing African tunes. The first one was Lini Who, that's a Malawian. Is it Malawian? That's a Malawian song that was really It really hit the internet in 2022. It's a song by a 92-year-old Malawian music legend. His name is Gides Chalamanda. The one that is playing right now is by Maroon Commando. It's called Charonyi Niwasi. Just finishing setting up the show today, we're going to be talking about some of the most influential Pan-Africans that we had, whose spirit lives up to date. Talking about the likes of KWAME, NKRUMAH, talking the likes of. We're going to be looking at them, all of them, when we come back. So of course you can tell me on the comments right below, who do you think is the most influential Pan-African that Africa has ever had? Yeah, so Charonyi Niwasi is a song by Maroon Commandos. It's translated, it has to be a coastal language. I don't know if it's a Kigiriam or something. I'm not familiar with the language in itself, but I know what the song is saying. The song is somebody who lives in Nairobi writing a letter to his relatives in the village. So he's trying to explain to them how life is hard in the city and how, everything in the city you have to buy, unlike in the village where everything is free. I don't even understand the language, but I know what the song is saying and I love it. It's a very, very cold day in Nairobi. It's about 17 degrees Celsius, if I'm not wrong, which is quite cold. It's actually 17 degrees Celsius. That's cold. We are used to 20 something going up. Ngome, I think it's ni pesa, it's money. So he's saying that even drinking water costs money in the city. Everything is money. So I love these old African jams. They take a time when Africa was Africa, really. So today we're going to be talking about Pan-Africanism and some of the most influential Pan-Africans that ever. So there are several of them. We're going to be looking at each and every one of them in depth, trying to understand the impact that they made and what can we learn from them, especially now at a time where Africa is in a crosspath in that it has reached a point where Africans have realized that they have been in a period of slumber, and they have started waking up. And when I say at a crosspath, we are at a point where we can either transition forward or transition backwards. So we're going to be looking at some of them, and of course some of the lessons that we can learn from the same. We're going to start with perhaps the most influential Pan-African to that I know, KWAME Nkrumah. So KWAME Nkrumah was born in Ghana. He's Ghanaian. He was educated in the US. However, during the airlifts that were held as Africa was heading towards independence, there were airlifts that happened all over Africa where the colonial powers would airlift Africans, take them to their countries, educate them there, in a hope that they are going to indoctrinate them into becoming their puppets, so that even when they leave, they still have their agents on the ground. So one of the beneficiaries of this was KWAME Nkrumah. That is how he was airlifted to the United States, where he studied. That is at around 1920s. When he came back, he went on to become the Prime Minister of Ghana and later the President, leading the country to independence in 1957. He's the one that led the country actually to independence. So one thing about KWAME Nkrumah was he was one of the biggest advocates for a united Africa, and he was one of the people who were really, really disappointed when the OAU was formed instead of Africa uniting. He was I'm sure I can find his speech and share it right now. He was one of the people who were really, really disappointed when the OAU was formed in Ethiopia. Instead of Africa uniting, they went ahead and formed the Organization of African Unity. He was really disappointed on that. He was later, of course, you know what happens to all those Pan-Africans. He was not the first, but he was, luckily for him, he was not assassinated. But he was overthrown and he had to go into exile. And unfortunately, when he was in exile in Romania, he died in 1972. So let me share a video of his speech so that you can see the type of leader that I'm talking about when I'm referring to KWAME Nkrumah. Some of the men who really meant and dreamt and worked and fought and died for a better Africa. I'm sure they must be really, really proud seeing what has been happening in Africa, especially for the last couple of weeks, because it shows that they did not die for nothing, because most of them died fighting for a united Africa, not just KWAME Nkrumah, but many, many others were assassinated, who we're going to be looking at later. And of course, at least they never died for nothing, because it has taken a lot of time. For example, Nkrumah died in 1972, PATRICE LUMUMBA died in 1961. It has taken time, but their spirit still lives on. You know, you look at the African youth and you're going to see the spirit of PATRICE LUMUMBA in them. You know, that spirit where that bravery that doesn't matter whether I'm going to die, doesn't matter what is going to happen, I'm still going to stand and fight for what I think I deserve as an African. So let me share a copyright disclaimer so that YouTube does not strike down my video. This video is only for educational purposes, news reporting, teaching, and research, which is permitted by YouTube.
It's ready to fight his own battle and show that after all, the black man is capable of managing the whole affairs. And my last warning to you is that you ought to stand firm behind us so that we can prove to the world that when the African is given a chance, he can show to the world that he's somebody.
So one of the rallying calls that Nkrumah is known for and remembered for is that of the independence of Ghana is the independence of Africa. If Africa does not become independent, then Ghana is not truly independent, and if Africa is independent, then Ghana is independent. So that is one of the most things that he's known for, because he knew at the time when many people did not know that as a single country, it was so easy for neo-colonialism to take root again, for imperialism to start, economic imperialism, political imperialism. It was so easy for the white man to come back when Africa was not united. And that is why you're seeing even here this is a very, very old video, a very, very old video that goes back to 1957. It's a 1957 video. But you can see, even at that time, he was not focused on Ghana, because he knew this was bigger than Ghana, something that many people at that time were unaware of. He knew that this was not about Ghana, this was about Africa, because Ghana as an entity is too small to against the global powers that had orchestrated the colonialism. So he knew Ghana as a country, Senegal as a country, was too small to stand for anything. That is why if you look at most of his speech, they were not centered around Ghana. They were centered around Africa. Even at the small part that I've played, you had him saying, we have to show them that Africa on its own can stand. He did not say we need to show them that Ghana on its own. He said Africa. And that divisive factor, which that border divisive factor has really eaten up Africa for the longest, where selfishness comes in, and I now consider myself Kenyan more than African. I consider myself Ugandan. I consider myself South African. I consider myself Nigerian. And it looks more, instead of us uniting for a better future, really for a better Africa that we all deserve, then it ends up being a competition amongst the poor, because we are all poor, even though we should be rich. So that aspect of competition, where Ugandans feel like Tanzanians are competing with them, you know, you saw Niger trying to sell, Niger struck a deal with China to sell oil, 120,000 barrels of them per day to China, but apparently their neighbor refused them passage, couldn't allow them to load the oils on their boats. You've seen that with Tanzania. I remember there was a time the Tanzanian president banned live Kenyan chicks on the border. You've seen that in Uganda. We've seen that all over Africa, where African countries think they are in a competition. They think that I'm Kenyan first, then African later. What they don't know is, or what they are ignorant about, is the fact that we are all Africans. And if somebody looks at you, if somebody is shown a photo of you, they wouldn't tell if you're Nigerian, if you're Congolese, if you're a Black American, if you're Jamaican. What they'll see is an African with your dark skin. Well, that is what they're going to see. They're going to see your beautiful dark skin, and they're going to see you as an African, not as a Ugandan. There's really nothing that can tell me you are a Ugandan unless I hear you speak, or unless I see you with an Ugandan flag. So that border divisive factor, where was actually one of the reasons Africa never united, because I know I've said this before. I saw a video of Mwalimu Julius Nyerere that was done later on in his life, when he was asked about why he was among the people who were against the immediate unification of Africa. And according to him, at that time there was so much distrust among African leaders, where an example of people who were fighting for the unification of Africa was Dako, and Dako was the suggestion was to have the capital city of Africa in Central African Republic, in CAR. That was the suggestion. And now, because of the distrust and the border divisive factor, people thought that why should the border be in Central African Republic and not in Tanzania? So of course I'm not going to support it. Why should the border be here and not here? Why should the president be this one and not this one? Why should the capital be here and not here? You know, that selfishness that has been brought about because of the division that was brought by the borders that were put, where now before you consider yourself an African, you consider yourself Nigerian first. And as I said, if somebody was to be shown a picture of you, they wouldn't see Nigeria and they would see an African. They wouldn't know if you're Jamaican, they wouldn't know if you're a Black American, they wouldn't know if you're Kenyan. So at that time, I love how at that time, even though it was a long time ago, it was 1957, NKRUMAH still knew the importance of having a unified Africa, and he knew the importance of unification and of speaking as Africa and not as Ghana and not as Nigeria.
Welcome to Candid Africa, truthful and unapologetic.
There is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs. And my last warning to you is that you ought to stand firm behind us so that we can prove to the world that when the African is given a chance, he can show to the world that he's somebody. We are waiting. We shall no more go back to sleep anymore. We are going to demonstrate to the world, to the other nations, young as we are, that we are prepared to lay our own foundation. As I said in the assembly just minutes ago, I made it point that we are going to say that we create our own African personality and identity. It's the only way in which we can show the world that we are ready for our own battle. But today, may I call upon you all that at this great day, let us all remember that nothing in the world can be done unless it has the purported support of God. We have done the battle, and we again rededicate ourselves not only in the struggle to emancipate other territories in Africa. Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent.
There you have it. Our independence is meaningless unless it's linked to the total liberation of the whole of Africa.
Struggle to emancipate other territories in Africa. Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent. And here, I will ask the band to play the Ghana national anthem.
NKRUMAH cried when he saw the independence of Ghana in 1957, and he many times repeated that the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it's tied to the total liberation of Africa. And many years later, that has been proven because apparently all the other African countries got their independence, with the last one being South Africa. But you look at the countries post and pre-independence, and it's a case of what Henry Mbuga was saying in The Enemy of the People, that it was better while we waited, in Betrayal in the City, that it was better while we waited. Now we have nothing to wait for and nothing to look forward to. So we claim that we are independent, and yet we live in abject poverty, and yet we cannot afford even the basic of healthcare, and yet we cannot even afford the basic of education, and yet we still have countries where people die of hunger. Ethiopia, Kenya, Gambia, So many years later, he's been proven to be right on the fact that if we do not tie the independence of African countries together and stand as a bloc, then it's going to be useless. The white man is going to come back. That was in 1957. And the white man did come back in each and every of those countries. And he started with Ghana. He went to every other African country, went to Nigeria. That was why coups and assassinations were that time, it was the time that Ngugi wa Thiong'o was saying that it's a very dangerous time to be educated and knowledgeable in Africa. So the reason this is very important is if you look at the current happenings in Africa, then you're going to realize that it's almost like a second liberation that is happening. A second liberation, but this time not from the actual physical colonization, but from now the neo-colonialism, which is of course worse than the other one, worse than the actual physical colonization, because that one used to disturb people, and that is why people fought, because they knew they were colonized, and of course when you know you are colonized, you're going to do something about it. But for the neo-colonialism, most people do not even know they're colonized. So many years later, Nkrumah's word and all his speeches have been proven to be right. He was a man who was wise and knew what he was saying at a time when other African leaders who were beneficiaries of the airlift too, and who had been placed in certain positions. Because I'm a big believer that everybody who was a first president in any country was placed there. The first president, first prime minister after independence, that is after the white man left. I might be wrong, but personally I believe every first prime minister, first president was placed there, because at that time not many people were even nuanced enough to know what was happening in the government. The media was non-existent, so people did not even know who their prime minister was or president. Not many people even knew how to read, if the media did exist, because they did have publications at that time, but not many people knew how to read. So voting was something that the Africans at that time did not even understand. They had been kept in darkness, in illiteracy, in poverty for long. So it was not even something that they would be able to think about at that time. So I'm a big believer that everybody who was either first prime minister, first president, was strategically placed there. And the problem was, now they thought that because they had airlifted you and they have been you've been in the US, they've sponsored your education in Portugal, because for the Portuguese colonies, they would take them to Lisbon. So they believed that you're going to push their agenda and initiatives. Unfortunately, that was never the case in most cases, and we found some true African sons and daughters who were airlifted, came back and did the right thing. One of them being NKRUMAH. And that was why at that period between 1957 to 1970, there were so many coups in Africa, because now they had to do away with all those they had airlifted that had not been indoctrinated, either by assassination or by overthrowing. Assassinations took away the likes of Patrice Lumumba, took away the likes of Amilcar Cabral. They took away the likes of Tom Mboya. They took away the likes of a lot of people. Really, the coups took away the likes of Dako, took away the likes of NKRUMAH. So they were trying to clear out everybody who was not participating in what they were expected to, because they had been placed there strategically. And I say again, I'm a big believer that every first prime minister, first president was placed. So they had been placed there to continue to further the European initiatives, even after the white man had left, to make sure that the countries remained poor and desperate, so that in that state of desperation, it would be easier to exploit them further. Even when they were not physically here, they would still have people exploiting Africans on their behalf. Because Chinua Achebe was saying that the new master, he dresses in our clothes. The new master, he eats our food. The new master, we grew up together with. The new master, he speaks our language. But he's dangerous than the old one. The new master was the puppets that were left, some of whom never proved to be puppets, and that is why we're talking about KWAME and NKRUMAH, a product of the airlift, came back, did what was right.
Freedom! Freedom! Freedom!
Did you like or hate?
And they did their part. Really, they gave us the first freedom, the first liberation from the physical colonialism at that time. And now we are fighting a different battle altogether. At least we're not fighting the physical. Still fighting the physical, but at least now they don't. The colonization that we have is mainly neo-colonialism. So what we are now fighting for is the second liberation of Africa, because the first one, our forefathers fought for that. The Mau Mau, the Maji Maji, the NKRUMAHs, the Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau. They did fight for the first, the Kaisa SEME of South Africa. They did fight for the first independence. So now it's up to us to, they passed on the mantle to us. So it's now up to us to continue with where they left, because things have not gotten any better. It's worse than it was yesterday. Every day you wake up and it's worse today than it was yesterday. Inflation hitting sky high, unemployment at an unimaginable rate, economy is dying, shrinking, insecurity all over because, of course, of the gap between the haves and the have-nots, corruption all over the government, people dying because of lack of, they can't access even the basic healthcare, you know. So it's every day it gets worse today than it was yesterday. That is why it's time for Africa to now liberate itself further. Not just for the current generation, but also for the next. Be as selfless as the likes of NKRUMAH when they were fighting for Africa's independence, even though they knew that they may not even be able to witness, they may not be able to see, they may not be able to experience the independence themselves. They might die in the fight, and they died in the fight. But you can see many years later, the things they did and their lives were not lost in vain. So let's summarize up on KWAME and NKRUMAH so that we can look at W.E. Du Bois. We are also going to be looking at PIXLEY, Kaisa SEME. We're going to be looking at PATRICE LUMUMBA of DRC. We are also going to be looking at Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau. Those are not the only Pan-Africans. Those are the ones that we're just going to be looking at today.
28th of February 1948, the British rulers of the Gold Coast region in Africa met an unprecedented shock. A group of ex-servicemen who had fought for the British in the Second World War marched towards the government office in Accra, the capital of the Gold Coast. The procession, which started in an orderly manner, was quickly hijacked by rowdy delinquents and soon degenerated into a threatening mob. They started the procession with the aim of marching towards the Secretariat office, but due to the turn of events, the ex-servicemen took the road leading towards Christiansborg Castle, the residence of the colonial governor. A small detachment of armed police officers, led by Superintendent Colin Imrie, blocked the procession at the crossroads. Imrie ordered the servicemen to stop, but they refused and continued to advance. Seeing this, the superintendent ordered one of his officers to shoot at the protesters, but this officer flatly refused. For fear of being overrun by the protesters, Imre tore a rifle out of the hands of one of his men and fired at one of the protesters, killing him instantly. He then fired 5 successive shots, resulting in the deaths of 3 ex-servicemen, Sergeant Francis Ajete, Corporal Patrick Atipo, and Private Odati Lamti. With the lifeless bodies of their comrades on the ground, the remaining protesters quickly turned around and made off towards the center of Accra. Violence was unleashed in full force. The angry mob set cars on fire, looted stores owned by foreign merchants, moved against the prisons, broke down the doors, and released the prisoners. Within days, the riot broke out in towns throughout the colony, leaving 29 dead and over 200 injured. A group of educated professionals and intellectuals from the Gold Coast, under the name of the United Gold Coast Convention, immediately sent a telegram to the colonial office in London demanding a commission and offering to form a government. The Working Committee of the United Gold Coast Convention declared that they are prepared and ready to take over the interim government. On hearing this, the colonial governor, Sir Gerald Creasy, arrested all the leaders of the UGCC, declared a state of emergency, and promulgated the Riot Act. This event would mark the beginning of Ghana's journey towards independence and set in motion the African Revolution. The man who would eventually play an important role in this revolution would be one of the leaders of the UGCC, the person of Dr. KWAME Nkrumah.
We begin in West Africa, one of the two great areas of the world where we have ruled but never settled.
By the end of the Second World War, the Gold Coast seemed to be a happy and contented colony, enjoying more prosperity than most parts of Africa. Cocoa farming was the backbone of the region's economy as it produced.
You have to give it to West Africa. It was where the whole revolution began back then, and it is still the same place where the second liberation has also begun in the Sahel. It's in West Africa. So you have to give it to West Africa. So it has always been monumental and very, very important in Africa's liberating Africa.
Used 2/3 of the world's supply. At this juncture, the colony had reached a level of political sophistication that was unmatched anywhere in Africa. The 1946 Gold Coast Constitution saw Africans having a majority in the Legislative Council for the first time. Seen as a major step towards self-government, this new arrangement prompted the colony's first true political party, the United Gold Coast Convention, the UGCC, which was founded in August 1947. The leaders, considered the founding fathers of the present-day Ghana, were collectively known as the Big Sis. They included Joseph Boakai Dankwa, Ebenezer Ako Adjei, Edward Akufo-Addo, Emmanuel Obisebe Lamti, William Ofori Atta, and Dr. KWAME Nkrumah, the party's secretary. The Gold Coast at the time was seen as one of the most stable colonies in the whole of Africa. But underneath this superficial calm and prosperity, several worrying factors emerged in the years.
And you can see how it all boils down to characters, the individual character of a person, rather than the level of indoctrination that a person is going to be subjected to. Because if you look at the 6 people, for example, who are the founders of the UGCC, which was very instrumental in the independence of Ghana, which also inspired the independence of other African countries. You look at the 6 of them. You look at the how they ended up, because all of them were educated outside Africa. They were among the few Africans who were educated at that time. They were all products of the airlift which was being done so that the white man could leave his agents when he left Africa, and his agenda would continue. Look at them and look at the difference in how they turned up to be.
Big Sis. They included Joseph Boakai Dankwa, Ebenezer Ako Adjei, Edward Akufo-Addo.
Came later. Now the president of Ghana is Nana Akufo-Addo. I don't know if it's the same one or the son to this one, but what I know is that the current Akufo-Addo is not even distantly related to, the character is not even anywhere close to that of KWAME Nkrumah. The current one is a very, very corrupt person. So people would be lifted on the same airlift and they would come back to Africa, very different people. The Kenyattas came back with the Tom Mboyas, and Tom Mboya was a true Pan-African. The other one, I don't want to talk about them. So it even boils down to you as a person, the kind of person you are. Are you greedy? Are you willing to see your fellow Africans die so that you can benefit as a person? Are you willing to actually stand for what is right? Because if you are, then that is what happened with the likes of KWAME NKRUMAH. That is what happened with the likes of the first Nigerian president. That is what happened with the likes of PATRICE LUMUMBA. That is what happened with the likes of Thomas Sankara. They, even after the indoctrination, even after living in the West, in Europe, in the US, for all that time, they came back to Africa and they still sided with the African people. But a few of those who were airlifted came back, started political parties. Like at that time, everybody was participating, everybody was playing a role in accordance to your capability, because this happened after the Second World War. So there were those who came back with military prowess. They knew how to handle guns. They knew how to get into the forest and actually attack physically. So those ones are the one who formed the likes of Mau Mau in Kenya, the likes of the Majimaji rebellion in Tanganyika, which is now called Tanzania, the ones who formed the armed rebellion wing, like the one that was there in Zimbabwe, the one that was there in Uganda, the one that was there in Ghana. And then there were those ones who were educated, those ones who would fight on the intellectual front. As those ones are fighting in the forest, the other ones would be writing publications, sending letters. PIXLEY, the likes of PIXLEY, SEME would be addressing students in the US, telling them about what was happening in Africa. The likes of Tom Mboya would be addressing meetings and processions in the US, telling them about what was happening in Africa. And so the battle was really fought from both sides. And the man on your screen, Edward Akufo-Addo, was also a former president in Ghana. He's the father of the current president, Nana Addo Akufo-Addo. Both very corrupt, the father and the son. And this man sat on the same table as KWAME NKRUMAH. At that time, they thought that they wanted the same thing, the liberation of Africa, because if you saw from the first speech, KWAME NKRUMAH never cared about Ghana. He never cared about the independence of Ghana. He knew Ghana was too little, and Ghana's independence as a country alone was irrelevant. That's why he always spoke about the independence of Africa, the liberation of Africa, not the liberation of Ghana. So this man sat on the same table as KWAME NKRUMAH and ended up being a very corrupt individual later. So I don't always, the talk that they did some of the things because they were forced to do it, they were puppets, they were, it boils down to you as a person. Are you willing to stand for what is right? Are you ready to die for the cause? Because all the others died for the cause. NKRUMAH died for the cause. He died in exile. While Edward Akufo-Addo ended up being a president, and of course, even his son ended up being a president. I'm not from Ghana, but I know this family must be a billionaire family. It must be having lots and lots of billions, having the father and the son both in power.
Emmanuel Obisebe Lamti, William Ofori Atta, and Dr. KWAME NKRUMAH, the party's secretary. The Gold Coast at the time was seen as one of the most stable colonies in the whole of Africa. But underneath this superficial calm and prosperity, several worrying factors emerged in the years that followed immediately after the Second World War. The biggest threat to the Gold Coast economy came from a disease called swollen shoot, which attacked the cocoa trees and was carried by the mealybug.
And if you want to know how much of a joke as a continent we are, for example, the last person on that list was Ofori Atta, and I thought that name was familiar. I thought I had heard that name somewhere else, Ofori Atta. I later came to realize that either his son or his grandson was the finance minister, even in Nana Akufo-Addo's government. So they were there. They left it to their sons and now their grandsons. It's like the same family is ruling us over and over and over and over. I mean, your father was there, now you the finance. He was the finance minister who was actually responsible for, partly responsible for Ghana's economic turmoil, because he was the one who was there when he was actually fired the other day and replaced by somebody else. So it's crazy that we can have one person leading us for, I don't know, 30 years, then they leave it to their son, and then they leave it to, that's selfishness of the highest order, and it happens in so many African countries. And most of those who are even leading for that long are not even the ones who fought for the real African independence. They were just people who were placed there because the white man wanted to have somebody continue with his agenda when he left.
It was first identified in the region around 1943, but despite prolonged research, no remedy could be found. The only way to prevent the spread of the disease was to cut out the infected trees. The government rightly saw the swollen shoot as a dire threat to the economy and enacted the cutting out policy. Under this policy, farmers were mandated to cut down and burn any infected trees. But these infected trees continued to produce healthy-looking pods for some time, and the cocoa farmers bitterly resented the policy. Swollen shoots certainly created a crisis in the cocoa-growing areas of the Gold Coast, but the next problem affected the whole colony. This problem was inflation. The government was even more inept when handling this problem. Shortage of shipping meant that many imported goods which had become essential in everyday life could not be obtained. The increase in the price of cocoa meant that there was more money in circulation, but only a few things to buy. The culprits of the inflation were the European and Syrian trading companies that handled the majority of imports and exports. They came together after the war to form a group known as the Association of West African Merchants. As middlemen, they could always offset inflation, and their continued prosperity caused deep resentments among the indigenous traders. One man, a Ga chief in the Accra region called KWAME, who was not only a prosperous businessman but was also a strong civic leader, came forward and channeled the anger and frustration that most people in the country felt. He spoke effectively against the European and Syrian merchants, and he quickly gained fervent support across the country. He proposed that unless the British and Assyrian stores reduced their prices, he would instigate a complete boycott of the imported goods. And on the 24th of January 1948, the boycott of all imported goods began and held up remarkably well. As a result, the members of the Association of West African Merchants agreed to cut down their high profit margins and put an end to the boycott. The strong
I think our biggest strength has always been in the numbers that we have, and it's a strength that I feel like we do not appreciate, understand, and make use enough. Because even, for example, in the Ghanaian case, you saw how them boycotting the imported products worked. And I think the other reason, one of the main reasons why colonialism failed in Africa was, I wouldn't call it the nuance, but when the people came back from the World War and now they knew how to handle firearms, and they had seen the white man bleed, they had seen in the war they had seen the white man bleeding to death, and now the godly image that they had placed on him was gone, and they knew that they could no longer be able to lead Africa because, of course, the numbers, they did not have the numbers to contain Africa, because our biggest strength is always in our numbers. Doesn't matter what they do, but the moment we realize that we actually have the numbers, then we will be unstoppable. The moment that we're going to realize that the power belongs to the people and we have the numbers, doesn't matter. That was actually the reason colonialism failed, because they couldn't hold it anymore. Doesn't matter how many people didn't partner, how many people they shot, more would come. They would kill and kill, but still more would come. They would detain. I know they had detention camps where they would detain and torture African freedom fighters. But the detention camps would get filled up, and still more fighters are fighting and more are getting recruited. And the fearlessness and the numbers has always been our biggest strength. And once Africa realizes that, even the second liberation, that is from neocolonialism, will be very, very easy. Not easy really, but will be achieved. Them knowing that it doesn't matter how many people they shoot dead, doesn't matter how many people they arrest, more and more are still going to come. And if you want to know how much of a worry our numbers are, look at how hard they tried to reduce the population, the numbers, to make them favorable to them. Look at all the issues with GMOs, genetically modified seeds. Look at all the issues with the vaccines that they always give freely to Africa. Look at all the issues with the vaccines on livestock. Look at all the issues with homosexuality being pushed down our throats. Look at all the issues of eugenics. Look at all the issues of the wars. Look at all the issues of even the brain drain. It's all a plan to make sure that they leverage and they reduce the numbers, because they know with the numbers that we have in Africa, it's very, very hard. Even though we do not really actually understand how much powerful and how impactful and how dangerous we are because of our numbers, they know that the moment we realize that, it's going to be over for them. And that is why they are really in a race to make sure that the numbers do reduce, so that even when the nuance finally kicks in, we will not be having the number advantage.
Feelings generated by the boycott and the swollen shoot disease lingered on for a while and finally amalgamated with the third and the greatest issue in the colony, the grievances of the ex-servicemen. A total of 63,000 ex-servicemen who fought on the side of the British during the Second World War returned home with high expectations for their future.
That was a big mistake on their side, which kids say they made unknowingly because they were desperate at that moment. But it was a very, very stupid mistake on their side. You now have 63,000 men coming back to Ghana. 63,000 men who did not have knowledge on how to use firearms, but now they are pros, and now they can operate all those firearms, all those war machines. Now you have 63,000 men who've just returned from war front, and they're coming back to their homes and finding that they're still colonized. Well, now we have 63,000 men who want their freedom. And in addition to that, we have other educated men who've been to the West, not in the battlefront, but in a different front, and they have seen the development, they've seen the life in the US, they've seen the life in Europe, they've seen the life in Lisbon, they've seen the life in the UK. So how did they expect that those people, having seen all that, because exposure is everything, if they had kept us in the dark like they had for all those years, then we wouldn't have gotten exposed to that other side of life. Then we wouldn't have known that, oh, the white man can die. We wouldn't have known that people live better lives than the ones we live. We need better, we deserve better. So now we have 63,000 men returning in Ghana. I don't know how many thousand men returning in Kenya. I don't know how many thousand men returning in Tanzania from the war, and coming back to finding that their land was grabbed by the same white man he had been fighting alongside. So I don't know how they expected that to turn out. I don't know if they expected the 63,000 men to return to Ghana and continue working as farm hands in their own land. But that was a very stupid mistake on their side that accelerated Africa's quest and Africa's fight for independence.
But then they had trouble obtaining employment and felt that the federal government wasn't doing enough to address their grievances. In February 1948, they met with the heads of the UGCC, and after which they felt the need to express their grievances to the governor. On the 28th of February 1948, the exact day marking the end of the boycott, a group of ex-servicemen marched towards the government office in Accra in a showdown that resulted in the Accra riots of 1948. The leaders of the UGCC were held responsible for orchestrating the disturbance and detained, only to be released a month later. Dr. KWAME Nkrumah, the party's secretary, received severe backlash from the leaders of the UGCC for his role in the riots. But overall, the arrest of the Big Sis raised the profile of the party around the country and made them national heroes. The British government set up a commission known as the Watson Commission to investigate the cause of the riots and the events of February 1948. The commission highlighted the inadequacies of Governor Christie and recommended another commission to be set up to draft a new constitution. This new commission, known as the KWAME Commission, employed the services of all the leaders of the UGCC with the exception of NKRUMAH in drafting the new constitution. But while the committee was preparing its report,
At that point, they'd already started seeing that NKRUMAH was not like the rest. He was rebellious. He was going to stand for the people. This is, of course, after he was the one who organized, one of the organizers of the Accra riot of 1948. So when they were drafting the constitution, of course, they sidelined him and worked with the other five because they knew that one was not going to stand in. That one was not easily corruptible. That is the word. So that was why he was sidelined when they were writing the constitution. And the Accra riots of 1948, and they already, because by now they had already started fighting for their independence, the people of Ghana. And I guess they have to be the first country in Africa that actually stood up. If there was another riot before 1948, I don't think there was another riot. But at this point, they had already started seeing NKRUMAH as an incorruptible man. How they ended up also making him the prime minister, I don't know. Even after they had seen him organize the Accra riots, even after they had seen him not as corruptible as the rest, how they ended up, even though that might have been as a result of the LEGCO, the legislative, the LEGCO in Ghana, because it reached a point where there were now more and more Africans in the LEGCO. But anyway.
The split in the ranks of the United Gold Coast Convention. Before the creation of the KWAME Commission, there was a rift between NKRUMAH and the other leaders of the UGCC, and its exclusion from the commission did nothing but exacerbate it. NKRUMAH's views on independence and how the party should be run were at variance with the others. While the UGCC paraded the slogan of self-government in the shortest possible time, NKRUMAH believed in self-government now. As a result of his variant views and his unwillingness to obey some of the party's code of conduct, NKRUMAH was dismissed as the secretary of the UGCC and demoted to the humble role of the party's treasurer. To share his perspectives on independence, NKRUMAH created a print media known as the Accra Evening News. It was devoted entirely to the struggle against imperialism. This newspaper went on to make a considerable impact throughout the colony. While the Accra Evening News was gaining immense popularity for NKRUMAH, his close colleagues set up a nationwide youth organization called the Committee on Youth Organization. It was initially a part of the UGCC, but as it grew in prominence, it became a separate entity. Encouraged by NKRUMAH, the CYO adopted the slogan of self-government now and continued to grow in power.
So at least NKRUMAH left the UGCC when he realized that it was just another bunch of puppets, bunch of people who were getting controlled from London, and started his own political party, and which you're going to see later the impact that it ended up having in Ghana's quest for independence.
Finally, in July 1949, KWAME Nkrumah completely left the UGCC and announced to a huge crowd the formation of the Convention's People's Party. He outlined the struggle of independence since 1947 and stressed the importance of self-government now. With this, Nkrumah immediately gained the overwhelming support of the masses. Nkrumah went on to organize an effective modern political party that was radical, forward-looking, and aggressive. Soon, the party colors of red, white, and green appeared in every town and village in the Gold Coast. The writing on the wall was self-government now. 2 months after the formation of the CPP, a new governor arrived at the castle, Sir Charles Adam Clark. Within weeks of his arrival, he faced his first crisis. Kwame Nkrumah and the CPP had threatened the government with strikes and civil disobedience, which they called positive action. This action, similar to the one staged by Mahatma Gandhi in India, encouraged all local workers to stay out of work until their demands for self-governance is met. The support for the positive action was widespread, and the government feared that the violence and strikes would bring the country to a grinding halt. Even after having a meeting with the colonial government and promised a general election within 6 months, Nkrumah nonetheless declared positive action. Faced with the threat of positive action and a general strike, Sir Adam Clark called an emergency meeting with the Legislative Council and imposed a state of emergency. As a result, Nkrumah and some leaders of the CPP were arrested. The violence during the positive action.
And somebody on a big shout out to General Mosquito who's just joining me. I'm doing good, General Mosquito, just talking about Pan-Africanism. How are you doing? And somebody else in the comments is saying that we've discovered that our images are being used on your page without consent. This issue has been reported to Facebook. Nah, it's actually allowed to use third-party images for educational purposes, Joseph Sotelo. So I don't think that scam that you're trying will work on me. I know that you are allowed to share videos for educational purposes. That is according to YouTube's and Facebook meta regulations. So you can as well report the video on Facebook. Nothing is going to happen.
Led to the deaths of 2 policemen who had been killed by a CPP mob. The court charged Nkrumah with inciting the people to take part in an illegal strike and trying to coerce the government. He was sentenced to 1 year's imprisonment on each charge. He was then taken to another court on the Cape Coast, where he received a further 1 year sentence for sedition in connection with a newspaper article. The 3 1-year sentences were to be served consecutively. After the trial at the Cape Coast, Nkrumah was brought back to the James Ford prison in Accra, where he joined 10 other CPP leaders. With the CPP leaders in jail, the British expected that the UGCC would have a clear run to victory in the forthcoming election, but it wasn't going to come so easily. By a remarkable coincidence.
So by now, they knew that the United Gold Coast Convention was just a bunch of, perhaps the first bunch of puppets we had in Africa was that, and rightly so, because you see what ended up being of the leaders who are left, the likes of Edward Akufo-Addo, who later on became the president, and later his son became the president. So the Big Six was really a bunch of 5 puppets and one person who knew what to stand for. So that was why they were never even arrested, because they were not a threat at all to anybody or anything that the colonial masters were trying to perpetrate to do. So they thought that by arresting Kwame Nkrumah and having his party out, of course, it was going to be an easy run now for the puppets, the other 5 who had formed the Big Six, that is the United Gold Coast Party. The United Gold Coast Convention was called the UGCC. So it's just as short. We're just wrapping up on Kwame Nkrumah. I was just looking at his rise to how he ended up becoming the Prime Minister of Ghana, and of course how he never really lasted in power, because he was a true Pan-African who did not care about Ghana at all, but cared about Africa, because he knew Ghana, Nigeria, Mali, all those colonial borders were just but a divisive technique, a divisive tactic. And Africa was Africa.
As Kwame Nkrumah entered prison, Komla Gbedema, one of his most trusted friends and colleagues, had just completed a 6-month sentence for publishing false information on the Accra Evening News and was about to get released. They both had a brief discussion and Gbedema agreed to organize the party while Nkrumah and the others were in prison. Nkrumah insisted that the CPP should contest all the seats in the forthcoming election of February 1951. He also ensured that his name appeared on the electoral roll since as an elector he was entitled to stand as a candidate. This was possible because his prison sentences were given for 1 year each, and under the Kosi Commission, only a sentence of more than 1 year disqualifies a person from voting or standing in an election. Gbedema had the knack for organization, and soon the CPP colors sprung everywhere in the Gold Coast with a clear demand of self-government now. By the end of the election, Nkrumah's CPP emerged victorious. And even though he was still in jail, with another 2 years to serve his sentence, the governor finally decided that Nkrumah should be released from the James Ford prison at 1 o'clock on Monday the 12th of February 1951.
A huge crowd cheers as Kwame Nkrumah leaves James Ford Prison freed by the governor as an act of grace on the eve of the inauguration of the new constitution.
The following day, the governor sent for Nkrumah and asked him to form a government. Nkrumah took up a title of the leader of government business in a cabinet chaired by Sir Adam Clark and became the prime minister in 1952 when the governor withdrew from the cabinet. As prime minister, he continued to seek constitutional reforms that would lead to independence. In 1954,
so perhaps the biggest difference between Nkrumah and other first African prime minister, first African presidents, who, when I say first, they're people who stayed in power up to their death. Most of them stayed in power until they died. Unless you stood for the people. If you did not stand for the people, then you are guaranteed to stay in power until your death. The likes of Kenyatta, the likes of, unless you stood for the people. When you stood for the people, you'd get either assassinated or murdered. So you can see the clear difference between the Pan-Africans, the true African sons, and the others, because Nkrumah, even when he took power, when he became the prime minister in 1954, the first thing that he was seeking to do was further constitutional reforms, even though he himself was already in government. That was not enough. His objective was not to be in government. His objective was not to be rich. His objective was not to become a millionaire like the others. His objective was not to secure wealth for him and for his family. He was still going on to fight for economic reforms, even though he had been given, they thought that this man has been disturbing us for far too long. And of course, if maybe we give him part of the government cake, he's gonna come down with his gimmicks, because to them they were gimmicks. But however, even as the prime minister in 1954, he was still fighting for further economic reforms for the independence, for Ghana to gain independence. Not for Ghana to gain independence, but for Africa to gain independence, because I'm sure he at that time already knew, and he was clear, and he said so in so many of his speeches, that he was not fighting for the independence of Ghana, but for the independence of Africa.
The second Gold Coast election was announced, and the CPP leaders were left in no doubt about its significance. You see, the previous election of 1951 was just to establish the government. But after several discussions with the British government, it was agreed that if the CPP wins the 1954 elections, independence would follow. With independence in sight, Nkrumah and his ministers began to launch their manifestos in Accra and various regions of the Gold Coast, telling voters to vote for the CPP to finish the job. After the election, the CPP won more than 2/3 of the seats in the Legislative Assembly. Independence was now in sight. For the first time in the British colony, Africans were given complete control of an entire cabinet.
On this eventful occasion, my colleagues and I are very happy to be the first members of the first African cabinet. The people of the country have reaffirmed their confidence in us and have given us the mandate to carry on and finish the job.
Nkrumah's hopes for a trouble-free transition to independence was soon destroyed by the leaders of the Ashanti region. The Ashanti had been amongst the greatest warriors in Africa and once ruled an empire as large as the Gold Coast. The area was also one of the wealthiest in the Gold Coast, rich in cocoa and gold. Within weeks of the election, the leaders of the Ashanti launched the National Liberation Movement to battle for a federal system of government and protect the power, wealth, and tradition of their region from the central government in Accra. It was led by Bafo Akoto, one of their senior ministers. The northern territories of the Gold Coast were also in favor of a federal system of government to protect their region, as they were the poorest and the least developed part of the Gold Coast. Their chiefs were strongly opposed to the idea of rapid independence and feared that the benevolent protection of the British would soon be replaced by the domination of black men from the south. The back and forth of these opposing ideas bettered the formation of the Northern People's Party in the north. In Ashanti, the National Liberation Movement soon became a powerful political force and a serious threat to Nkrumah's aim of a smooth run to independence. Soon, some high-profile members of the CPP began to leave the party for the NLM. Violence soon became the order of the day in Ashanti as the National Liberation Movement and the CPP created strong armed gangs to travel the region, threatening each other. These gangs were known as the Action Groupers and the Action Troopers, respectively. Their intimidation turned to killings when in October 1954, E.Y. Bafo, an official for the National Liberation Movement and a defector from the CPP, was murdered by Tumasi Ankara of the CPP. The political parties were now facing each other in a full-blown gang warfare. The Action Groupers of the National Liberation Movement took control of key areas in Ashanti, forcing the CPP supporters in the Ashanti capital.
So that was as Ghana was now, the independence of Ghana was now imminent at this point. Gold Coast by then. The independence of Gold Coast was imminent by then. So of course now at that point, what was needed was internal division, internal wrangles, so that it can take away the focus from now people focusing on getting independence as a country. And that was how the National Liberation Movement was formed, where it acted as another divisive factor. So now what happened in the Ashanti, what happened now was, instead of people focusing on the Ghana getting independence, they were now fighting amongst themselves. So where the enemy sets you up against each other as he continues with his business. So now I don't have to worry about anything because you're fighting amongst yourself anyway. So it's the same thing that is happening right now. So you can see how far back dates. It's the same thing that is happening right now. Look at Congo, look at Central African Republic, look at Ethiopia, look at Sudan, look at Nigeria, look at even in parts of Mali. That is where several groups are paid and sponsored and armed and financed. And now, for example, in Congo, there are more than 100 armed groups fighting against each other. So who cares about what is happening in, who even cares about who's the president in Congo? And if I'm a member of a certain group, I have 99 other groups after my head. armed groups. I have 99 other armed groups after my head. So now the people of Congo fight against each other, fight amongst each other instead of fighting against the enemy. And now the enemy just passes in between the chaos and the wars and continues with his agendas. It dates back as far as 1950s in Ghana, the sponsored chaos technique, where if I need, for example, to take control of Kenya, I just need to start a Kenyan liberation movement and arm it, finance it, and have people believe that they are fighting for a legitimate cause. And of course, chaos are going to erupt, and now this one is fighting against this one, and this one against this one. And now nobody focuses on the enemy anymore.
Of Kumasi to flee and take refuge in Accra. The violence
The reason
got
I've
so
said that, I've given that perspective, is because with the political temperatures that are there in Africa at the moment, with, of course, everybody now aware of the neo-colonialism and the protests and the demos that have been happening in Uganda, in Kenya, in Nigeria, in with the political temperatures at the moment, with the level of nuancy, with the unrest, and with, of course, people now wanting to do away with neo-colonialism once and for all, that might be the book that they run to. That might be their playbook now. They might go back to the Ashanti playbook that they played in the 1950s in Ghana. They might now start. You might now start seeing. You have now. Let me correct myself. You've now started seeing, for example, in Mali, armed groups erupting, and we had 100 people killed. The other day we had those other ones that were killed in a wedding. Burkina Faso the same. So the Ashanti playbook is going to come into place now, where if you look like the nuance is too much, and of course they need to have you toned down, because they now know propaganda can't work, and with social media and access to knowledge and information, this might be their last playbook, where they now sponsor chaos in different parts of Africa. For example, if Uganda was to start demos on Monday, a terrorist attack happens somewhere in some part of Uganda, and now the focus is no longer on the demos but on the who was responsible for that, and now people come up against each other, and the neo-colonialism agenda goes on. So beware, be careful of that, because that might be the on the shelf playbook now.
so bad that it became unsafe for Nkrumah and his ministers to visit the Ashanti region. In curbing the violence in the Ashanti region, Sir Arden Clark decided to pay a visit to the ruler of the Ashanti kingdom, but he faced an angry crowd of protesters, some of whom attacked his car on his way back from the visit. The people of Ashanti criticized the governor for his unwavering support for Nkrumah and the CPP. Nkrumah was falsely reminded of the intensity in Ashanti when, at the height of the crisis, there was a serious attempt to assassinate him. While sitting in his house one evening, along with his secretary and a few colleagues, a large explosion blew through all the windows. Luckily for Nkrumah, he escaped unhurt. The police reported that had the explosive been set up correctly, it would have been enough to raze down the entire building. After 2 years of constant violence, the National Liberation Movement managed to convince the Colonial Secretary, Alan Naylor Boyd, that another election must be held. Although the CPP didn't like this, the election took place in 1956. Again, the CPP won with a massive majority. Still, the National Liberation Movement wasn't prepared to give up. They refused to take their seats in the Legislative Assembly, refused to discuss independence, and insisted on embarking on a federal system. This time, the British government rejected their request. The rejection caused a furious reaction in the Ashanti, and talks were made about breaking away from the Gold Coast. Worried by the reports that the colony was on the brink of a civil war, the colonial secretary decided to talk with the ruler of the Ashanti region. Finally, they agreed that some elements of power for the region must be included in the new constitution. In September 1956, Nkrumah announced that full independence would follow in 6 months, and that the new state would be called Ghana, named after the great empire of the 11th century. On the 6th of March 1957, Ghana became the first Black African country to gain independence.
It was on this day that NKRUMAH gave the speech that saw him not assassinated, that saw him overthrown a few years into. So it being the first African country to gain independence, it being the first African country to struggle for independence and gain it, of course, that was going to be, at that time, quite a few Africans had gotten educated, and such news are going to spread because there were publications. I'm aware, for example, in Kenya, we had a publication, even in Kikuyu, we even had publications that were written in local dialect. So news of Ghana getting independence were going to spread, and we also had, it was around this time that the East African airlift was taking place at around 1958, and Ghana gained independence in 1957. So of course, news of Ghana's getting independence were going to spread throughout the whole of Africa through those other Africans who are in Europe, who are in the West, who are in America. And that did inspire the fight, because it was at this point, it was a few years into Kenya's state of emergency declaration. The Maji rebellion had also started kicking in. So Ghana's independence was the beginning of Africa's first independence. And I'm saying first independence because it was an independence because we got independent, but not really independent. And if we had listened to what NKRUMAH was saying, because he deserved to be listened to, considering he was the one who drove the first African country into independence. So he was a man who knew what he was saying and what he was doing. And even after that, if you listen to this speech was in 1957, he says the independence of Ghana is not, Ghana getting independence without the rest of Africa getting independence is really not going to change anything in Ghana. The independence of Ghana has to be tied with the liberation of the whole of Africa. He repeated the same words when they had the conference in Ethiopia later in 1962. The same words, telling the Africans that, you know what, even if you guys are independent and some other African countries are not independent, it's for nothing. The liberation and the independence of Africa has to be tied. And he was among the people who were really, really disappointed with the formation of the OAU, which is now the AU in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 1962, if I'm not wrong, because it was just but a vehicle to further the colonialism agenda, the neo-colonialism agenda. What he had wanted was a unified Africa, because even in the speech after Ghana gained independence, in the speech he was not even talking about Ghana. He was talking about how it's now a time for us to show them that Africa, if left alone, can be a force to reckon with. He was talking about, you know, he actually cried on this day with, you know, but we never listened to KWAME NKRUMAH, we never listened to PATRICE LUMUMBA, we never listened to those Pan-Africans who were calling for the liberation of Africa at that time, because we let the divisive borders lead us. We now started speaking in terms of I'm Nigerian, I'm Kenyan, I'm Tanzanian. We started not having trust in each other. Like I said in the beginning of the show, we had people like Mwalimu Julius Nyerere talking about how he knew KWAME NKRUMAH was talking the truth, but of course they did not trust each other at that time, because he was Tanzanian, the other one was Ghanaian, the other one was, and they were asking questions like, why is Dako suggesting that the capital city of Africa should be in Central African Republic? Why not Tanzania? What is his objective? Why are they suggesting this? Who's going to be the leader? Do they, you know, the distrust that has been brought about by the borders, because I know they were brought by the borders, because were it not for the borders, then Nyerere would have trusted what Nkrumah was saying. But now when he looked at Nkrumah, he did not see an African, he saw a Ghanaian. And when Nkrumah looked at, it was a moment that if you had taken advantage of, then Africa would have changed for good since then. I'm talking about the 1961 conference that followed the Ghanaian independence and the independence of several other African countries such as the DRC and those countries that got independence first. So it was a moment that had we actually taken advantage of, then we would not even be talking about the Africa that we have today, because we were just off getting independence, the first one. Because when I say the first one, I mean the independence from the physical colonialism, and now the procession to the neo-colonialism that is even more dangerous than the other one.
At long last, the battle has ended. And thus, Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever. And now, there is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs.
Finally, Nkrumah's call for independence had been achieved, and with it came a certain calm from the opposition. But this calm, which was welcome all over the country, did not last for long. Nkrumah had only a short honeymoon before unrest gradually started spreading amongst his people. Almost as soon as independence was achieved,
not unrest started gathering around his people, but it started getting orchestrated. They started, of course, planting the seeds of doubt. They started the same script, the same Ashanti script from the 50s, where now you're going to see, I don't know, new political parties cropping up, opposing whatever he's doing, whatever he's saying, armed rebellion from unknown, it's the sponsored chaos, because they thrive in the disunity and the chaos, because they know in the midst of chaos and anarchy and disunity and totalitarianism, it's so easy to overthrow, assassinate, exploit African countries. So as soon as Ghana got independence, as soon as Nkrumah started the talk of unifying Africa, as soon as he started rallying other African leaders such as Dako and Patrice Lumumba to join him in having a unified Africa, as soon as he started having talks with the likes of Haile Selassie, as soon as he started having talks with the other African leaders about unifying Africa, of course, that was the next thing that was going to happen. They were going to make sure that there would be unrest and portray the image of him being rejected in his own place, in his own home, even though you saw how many elections were held that he won all of them. Even sometimes elections would be held while he was not even physically present to campaign. He won elections in jail in Nkrumah. He would be in jail and they would vote him in, they would vote his party in. He left the UGCC. Where did the UGCC go? The United Gold Coast Convention. So, of course, they were going to start those rebellions, those groups, to try and topple him, to try and intimidate him, to try and blackmail him into falling back with the unification of Africa talk. Was that going to work on Nkrumah? No, Nkrumah was a man of his words. Not easily corruptible, and that is why he left the UGCC early on. That is why they never even involved him in the drafting of the Ghanaian constitution, because they knew he would not be party to oppressive clauses that would oppress the people of Gold Coast.
severe disturbances began taking place in the Togoland region of Ghana. This unrest known as the Alanvayo riots, saw threats of violence flying in the air. One of Nkrumah's first acts after independence was to dispatch police and troops to suppress the insurrection. Shortly after, there was another revolt among the Ga people in Accra who believed that members of the other tribes were getting preferential treatments in different government positions. Nkrumah responded by repressing the local movements and enacting the Avoidance of Discrimination Act of December 1957, which banned political parties from operating on a regional, tribal, and religious basis. Further unrest in the Ashanti and other minority regions led to the Prevention Detention Act of 1958, under which suspects could be imprisoned without trial for up to 5 years. This act in particular was used and abused on an ever-increasing scale as it grew on to become the most notorious instrument of repression throughout Nkrumah's regime. For months, Nkrumah managed to distill nearly all the Ashanti chiefs who supported the National Liberation Movement and replaced them with CPP supporters. These rather sinister moves, coming so soon after independence, alarmed all the opposition members who saw the power of the CPP as a growing menace. Prompted by these worrying developments and by the clear intentions of the Avoidance of Discrimination Act, the opposition parties came together to form the United Party in November 1957 under the leadership of Kofi Abrefa-Bossia. On the 20th of December 1958, Nkrumah was about to set off an official visit to India.
How an African politician is doing the right thing and is siding with the people and is actually on the verge of changing their countries for the better is when they start assassination attempts. Nkrumah was not in power for a year before the first assassination attempt on him. He was not even in power for a year when they first had his first assassination attempt. We're talking about at a time where the first African prime ministers and presidents ruled to their death. They would rule for 20, 30 years. They would be left to rule until they die. And when they died, their sons would take over. But Nkrumah was not left in power for a year before. I mean, even the opposition party formed a party about 3 months into his. He was not even in office yet. 3 months into 3-4 months into his tenure, and already there was a opposition party. All the opposition leaders had been grouped together. Let nobody lie to you that they regrouped themselves. They had been grouped together because apparently Nkrumah was becoming too much of a threat. Too much of a threat, not just in Ghana, but to the rest of Africa, because he was not just talking about Ghana, which, I mean, talking about Ghana was dangerous enough, but this man was now talking about the whole of Africa. Now talking about showing the world that the black man is capable of running his own affairs. In 1957, and at that time, not many African countries were independent, by the way. Maybe 1 or 2. I actually think it was only Ghana that was independent at that time. So, of course, that type of talk was going to spark rage in other African countries. It was going to accelerate the fights, was going to accelerate the rebellion in other African countries. So, Nkrumah at this point was a threat, and a big, big threat to the colonial masters, and he had to be gotten rid of. That is why they never even let him finish a year before they started having assassination attempts.
When a plot to assassinate him at the airport was discovered, the plot centered around 2 opposing figures who allegedly approached the commandant at the military camp near Accra and offered him money to get his troops to take part in the assassination. On the night of the planned assassination, they moved silently to a rendezvous location that had easy access to both the military camp and the center of Accra. There, they waited anxiously for the remaining group to arrive. After a considerable time, a vehicle approached. Expecting their fellow conspirators to get out, they were taken completely by surprise when members of the security force sprang out and arrested them. they had been betrayed by one of their conspirators. Whether NKRUMAH knew of the plot or not is not known, but he decided to continue with his visit to India. Slowly but surely, during the course of his regime, NKRUMAH's real plans began to emerge. He began to implement his socialist views, which he had always openly expressed but wasn't prominently accepted during the struggle for independence. Now, he intended that Ghana should become a socialist state and soon realized that to achieve this, he had to surmount serious difficulties. He started to align himself and the country with the Eastern Bloc, resulting in his unpopularity with the West. But by and large, his genuine attempt to create a socialist state must be accounted for as a complete failure. He spoke of idealism and integrity, but the message never really got across. The greatest single contribution to the failure of all his schemes lie in his indifference to financial issues and his refusal to demand honest accounting. This opened the floodgates to corruption at every level. The issue of finance created serious tensions between him and Komla Gbedema, who was of immense help during the struggle for independence. Having organized the 1951 election when Nkrumah was in prison, Gbedema guided the financial affairs of the party and the government from then on. Now, as the finance minister, he became increasingly alarmed at Nkrumah's irresponsible attitude towards finance. After Ghana became a
But one
republic,
thing that I'm sure of is if Nkrumah was as corrupt as the video is trying to portray him as, if he was tolerating corruption and actually doing what other African leaders were doing at that time, because at that time every other African leader was trying to get rich, trying to steal as much money as they could, then they wouldn't have attempted to assassinate him, because that was the plan. Then he would have been playing to the book, which was benefit yourself and to make sure the people do not benefit at all. Your objective is to run our affairs, and our kickback to you is we're going to make you billionaires. That is why every other first African president was a billionaire. And a big shout out to General Mosquito, who's with me, and Jiba Jaba, who's just joined. So that was I guess that was the agreement that every first prime minister, president, government had with the colonial masters. You just have to run our affairs. In return, we're going to make you rich. I mean, look at whoever replaced Patrice Lumumba in DRC, ended up becoming one of the richest men in Africa at that time, because DRC is rich, and of course he was getting his cutbacks not just from corruption, but from the illegal mining and exploitation of Congos, back then called Zaire's resources. Mobutu Sese Seko ended up becoming one of the richest men Africa has ever seen. Look at every other African president at that time, rich, thinking rich. So if indeed Nkrumah was corrupt, then why would they need to assassinate him when he was playing by the books? Because the books were for you not to help your people. The books were for you to keep your people ignorant. The script was for you to make sure your people are never educated, they are ignorant, and then it would be easy to control them, one, and it would be easy for the colonial masters to exploit Africa further, to drive their agendas, even though they were not actively present at the moment. And so for me, Kwame Nkrumah has to be one of the most influential Pan-Africans. Why? Because he drove Ghana to independence, becoming the first African country to get independence, which of course sparked further fights for independence in Africa. So today we're to look at Kwame Nkrumah. We're also to look at PIXLEY, Kaisa SEME of South Africa, ISAKA SEME, who not many people know about him actually, but he's one of the most influential Pan-Africans that we ever had. He established the first political party in South Africa, the first South African Native Farmers Association, which was encouraging farm workers to buy land and attain personal independence. He's actually the one who led the white government in South Africa to enact what was called the Natives Land Act of 1913, which barred black people from owning land in South Africa. Why? Because he was a learned man in 1912 already. He was actually the founders. He was one of the founders of the ANC, which later saw South Africa gaining independence in whichever way they gained it. But already in 1911, Kaisa Kaseme was already encouraging farm workers to buy land so that they can attain personal independence. I mean, why do you have to work as a farmhand in Africa when you are an African? So that led to South Africa passing the Natives Land Act in 1913. So black people are not allowed to own land in South Africa. They were barred from that. He worked with other leaders, formed other groups, formed other political parties, but he was assassinated also. I remember he even went to London in 1922. He addressed students in the United States in 1914, telling them about what was happening in Africa, because some people did not know what was happening with the conquest and the oppression and the murders that were happening in Africa. He was later assassinated because at that time Africa was a very dangerous place to be if you are knowledgeable or nuanced. But also to look at some other Pan-African. I'm sure we're going to go through this in details next week. We were to look at Amilcar Cabral, who was a Guinea-Bissau freedom fighter. He was also assassinated. But unfortunately, I'm out of time, and HR, the messenger, is coming up in a bit. This has been the Diary of a Young Black King. Today we're looking at we were celebrating Pan-Africanism, and we're looking at some of the most influential Pan-Africans whose spirit lives on to date, especially with what has been happening in Africa for the past couple of weeks. You've been seeing what has been happening in Africa for the past couple of weeks, with the demonstrations, with the second liberation. That is what we are calling it, the second liberation. This time not from the physical, actual colonialism that we had, but now from the neo-colonialism, the colonialism of the systems, the colonialism of the mind, which is more dangerous than the colonialism that the KWAME NKRUMAHs were fighting against. I'm going to leave you with, once again, KWAME NKRUMAH's speech on the independence of Africa. One of the most powerful speeches that you're ever going to listen to, and that is going to drive Africa into even the second liberation, even the second independence that we actually fighting for at the moment. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your weekend. I'm going to leave you with this speech. See you on Monday on the Black Hot Fire updates. It's always a pleasure, ladies and gentlemen.
To candid Africa, truthful and
is ready to fight his own battle and show that after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs. And my last warning to you is that you ought to stand firm behind us so that we can prove to the world that when the African is given a chance, he can show to the world that he's somebody. We are waiting. We shall no more go back to sleep anymore. We are going to demonstrate to the world, to the other nations, young as we are, that we are prepared to lay our own foundation. As I said in the assembly just a minute ago, I made a point that we are going to say that we create our own African personality and identity. It's the only way in which we can show the world that we are ready for our own battle. But today, may I call upon you all that at this great day, let us all remember that nothing in the world can be done unless it has the purpose and support of God. We have done the battle, and we again rededicate ourselves not only in the struggle to emancipate other territories in Africa. Our independence is meaningless unless it links up with the total liberation of the African continent. And here, I will ask the band to play the Ghana national anthem.